Now on Wisdom Radio, live from the Peace Room with Barbra Marx Hubbard. A worldwide celebration of human potential. Now, from the studios of the Foundation for Conscious Evolution in Santa Barbara, here's Barbra Marx Hubbard.
Welcome to Live from the Peace Room. This is Barbara, and today I'm with my guest, Ashok and we're discussing the awakening of the global mind. And I'm setting the scene for you. We're here in Santa Barbara. We're in a hub in virtual reality, and the Peace Room is scanning, mapping, and connecting worldwide those individuals' ideas, projects, and initiatives which are now building the new culture. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Gangadeen with us because he is, in a way, in every field because of the awakening of the global mind. He's a professor of philosophy at Haverford College, where he has taught for the past 35 years. He was the first director of the Margaret Guest Center for Cross-Cultural Study of Religion at Haverford and has participated in many professional conferences on interreligious dialogue and East-West comparative philosophy. Welcome, Ashok.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Pleasure to be with you tonight.
Yes. I just have been reading a new paper of yours that's going to be published called A Missing Global Blueprint for Integral Studies in Education. And I'm just so deeply touched by it. And I just want to start bringing up some questions from this paper. It seems that you're identifying a fundamental problem on Earth today and giving us a fundamental solution. And I'd like you to identify what you think is the fundamental problem, and then we'll talk about how your work leads us towards a fundamental solution.
Well, the fundamental problem that I found after 35, 40 years of working across different cultures and philosophical traditions and worldviews is that the great spiritual traditions and philosophies through the ages have really noticed that when people are kind of stuck in an egocentric way of processing themselves and making their worlds and shaping their experience and living from an egocentric way of thinking, we haven't realized that that's a profound technology, a stage of processing information and using our minds. And even though the great spiritual geniuses, East and West and indigenous and others, have all noticed that egocentric thinking is a problem and it's not our most mature form of being a coherent, rational, intelligent thinkers. And they have indicated strategies for awakening the mind beyond ego to more profound, integral ways of thinking. In the Buddhist tradition, for example, it's called the awakening out of ego, into a unified, integral, holistic field in which all things interact and co-arise. And that's just one way of putting the point about an awakening of the mind. And I think that when you speak of the basic problem, I think when you look across these worldviews and not see it only from one narrative perspective or worldview, it's very clear, this pattern, that egocentric thinking creates fragmentations, breaches, dualities, incoherences, and we cannot be integral human beings and integral thinkers when we're in that way of thinking.
Yes. It's interesting that the origin of the great faiths and the great traditions of humanity came from that unified field and that integral holistic thinking. But the people didn't have the consciousness to hold that field themselves. So they took the teachings, but they took them sometimes in an egocentric manner. So the question I have is how, in the modern world, when separation has become so deadly, do we actually tap into the unified field and develop what you call a global grammar or new way of thinking that actually is almost postmodern?
Well, that's well put, Barbara. Because when we say postmodern, often postmodern is situated and lodged within that egocentric way of thinking. It doesn't really get to this deeper grammar, and in fact, it is reluctant to even countenance that there is a fundamental grammar. That's part of the
Exactly. In fact, it sees everything in fragments.
That's right. And so when you ask how is it done, I think, again, this is not something new. I think the great traditions have all prescribed pathways into this more integral, mature mind. If you read the Bhagavad Gita, for example, the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna, where Arjuna is now on the battlefield. He's broken down. He's facing his own family in a war, and he realizes his conscience is pierced and he cannot do this, and he asks Krishna for help. Now, Krishna's voice is this deeper, higher voice of whether you call it Om or the unified field or integral thinking or meditative mind. Doesn't matter what designation you use. It's speaking from that integral space, from the deeper grammar.
Right, and all our great scriptures were written from the unified field.
Exactly right.
And it was interesting to me that you raised the question in this paper, if that's true, why are the religions so different? For example, in the Buddhist tradition, there is no God, no primal being, whereas in the Judeo-Christian, God is the creator of it all. And I'd like to get your understanding of how, when they tap into the unified field, apparently there are these differences.
Well, I think we have to distinguish two ways of appropriating the scriptures and the different traditions. There's no question that in the deepest way there is diversity amongst the religions. But I think that what I've found in my research over the years is that this missing deep grammar, I use the word logos for it, and logos meaning whether you speak of Tao or Om or Allah or Yahweh or Christ consciousness or the ultimate unified energy of the universe, the different traditions and disciplines have known that there's a fundamental ultimate principle and have tried to name it differently. And when you name it from our different grammars, we've lacked a fundamental coherent grammar, a global grammar, if you will. And this is what I've been trying to help to articulate. And I use the word logos in this global sense for the primal name. And
yes.
If one enters into this logos grammar, this fundamental field, you process the religious narratives very differently than if you interpret it from the ego mind.
This
and
is
I think
so
that
true.
is that we've seen that is so divisive on the planet, where you might find a clash of religions, very violent clashes. It's from misappropriating this deeper narrative from the logos that was spoken from that. So, for example, when Buddha is speaking, not in terms of God language, but speaking of the fundamental dharma, of the unified field, which is very different than the way Krishna instructs Arjuna, of the Atman, or the Brahman, or very different from the way Lao Tzu would speak of the Tao, or that one may speak of Allah. It's true that those are profoundly different names, and they are indeed different, but it makes all the difference whether one interprets those languages from the egocentric perspective, where they become quite divisive and irreconcilable, or whether one encounters them from this deeper logos, where one finds that the logos is so profound and rich in its infinite power that it can accommodate and generate multiple alternative ways of expression. And that's where I think we can find the real deep diversity across these religious traditions.
I was thinking as you spoke about this string theory and the string, about the string theory. Can you hear me? Hello?
But I got you now.
Okay. I was thinking as you spoke about the string theory and that the fundamental particles are actually notes,
yes.
vibrational fields coming out of a unified field, and that the universe is a symphony. It's music. So you could say that the different vibrational strings that came out of different cultures were in order to make this symphony.
Absolutely. Well said, Barbara. I think that's right. And that idea of a fundamental vibration, whether it's coming through science or through, say, the Vedantic philosophy, where it knows that the ultimate infinite symbol, a word for logos, is Om, which is infinite vibration, which is a generation of sound and music, so that the ultimate, and number, and harmony, and ratio, and measure, all of this traces to that fundamental vibrational field, which has diversity built into it. I would say then that your excellent question about why is there diversity in the ultimate spiritual narratives, it's because the logos, since it's infinite, has infinite variety built into it from the start.
Yes, that's so beautiful. And I want to know why you use the word grammar, which I think of the most boring sort of learning how sentences work. And you're talking about it in such an exalted manner.
Well, in a way, it's a good question, and it is a simple response. I agree that my training originally was in logic and ontology or metaphysics. And from the earliest beginnings of philosophy, If you go back to Plato and Plato's, great dialogue, the Sophist, and he was talking about the depth of philosophy, he realized that there was a grammar of reality. We tend to think of language in our egocentric ways, but when you realize that the logos is the infinite word, ultimate reality is wordful. It is the infinite word, and the infinite word has a structure and law-like patterns.
In the beginning was the Word.
Pardon me?
In the beginning was the Word.
Exactly. So when we realize that it's the Word that's ultimate reality, then it's very natural to think of its structure as a deep grammar, which is to say simply a compositional structure, or the way things are in pattern ways held together.
Is that like a subject, object, verb? I mean, some languages have subject, object, some do not.
Mm-hmm.
Some have verbs and no nouns.
That's right.
So are we talking at that level, or is there an even deeper level of universal grammar here?
Again, that's a good question. No, we're talking at a deeper level.
Yes.
Look at linguistics, and where we usually use the word grammar in the more egocentric ways of talking, then there are vast differences amongst natural languages at the linguistic level.
Yes.
People like Chomsky, for example, who tried to get to a deeper grammar in his syntactic structures. He's just one of many, many thinkers through the ages who realized there is a deeper language. Leibniz was looking for this more fundamental way of decoding reality, to read the basic language of reality. That's why it's grammar. So it is a deeper level. So that even though human natural languages will appear very differently to us, the classical vision was that at the deepest level there would be a depth grammar that would be generative of these many languages.
Yes, you have a beautiful way of saying it, that the integral mentality has a direct encounter with the presence.
Yes.
So at a certain level of mind, or as you call a minding,
yes,
a person is able to have a direct encounter with the unified field.
That's right.
And probably then would express it in their own language, but still they're at the deeper level.
That's right.
So I wanted to ask you about, because in your dialogic methodology, you seem to be able to help people, even when they have differences with each other, to have a more direct encounter with presence.
Well, yes, and again, the key to that, Barbara, is moving out of an egocentric view. I'm one of the co-founders of the Global Dialogue Institute, and I should mention what we call deep dialogue. Dialogue, when people use the word dialogue, very often from egocentric perspectives, they really mean monologue. It's really telling the other person what your position is and interpreting the other person from your perspective. Mm-hmm. Dialogue at the deeper level, at the deepest level, is when you step back from privileging your own language and perspective and are able to morph your mind, so to speak, into the perspective and ecology of the other world. Mm-hmm. And if we can do that, and there's skills that are teachable to help people move into other worlds and see the world profoundly in different ways. And when one experiences that dilation of one's mind, so to speak, and entering multiple alternative ecologies of mind or worldviews, something profound opens up, which is where I speak of the global mind awakening. And one
you see, I think you're really talking about the evolution of human consciousness.
If I'm missing you here now.
Yes, Austin, we will be right back after with my guest Ashok. This is Barbara, and you're listening to Live from the Peace Room on Wisdom Radio.
Wisdom Radio now returns to Live from the Peace Room with Barbra Marx Hubbard.
Welcome back to Live from the Peace Room. This is Barbara, and I'm with my guest, Dr. Ashok Gangadeen, and we're discussing the awakening of the global mind. Ashok is founder-director of the Global Dialogue Institute that seeks to embody the dialogic powers of global reasons in all aspects of cultural life. His book, Meditative Reason Toward Universal Grammar, attempts to open the way to global reason, and a companion volume, Between Worlds, The Emergence of Global Reason, explores the dialogic common ground between diverse worlds. Ashok, we were right at a most important point, and I asked you if you felt that this ability to tap in directly to the unified field is the evolution of consciousness that has been prefigured in the great mystics and beings, but that perhaps is being called forth at a new level as a new norm.
Yes, I'm missing some of your lines, Barbara, but...
Oh, I'm sorry. They're having some trouble here. But I just asked you if you felt that we're having an evolution of consciousness that was prefigured in the earlier great founders of our religions, but that for some reason more of us are open to direct encounter with the presence. Because if that's not so, it's hard to imagine how enough of us are going to do it.
Well, I think it is profoundly prefigured, and that's really one of the findings of my book, The Awakening of the Global Mind. And I'm trying to retell the story of human cultural evolution from the point of view of the Logos we spoke of earlier. The Logos under being the global, deepest, infinite name that is common to all our different worldviews. Once one begins to recognize that the infinite Logos is the primal condition and begin to reconceive of the evolution of cultures, you can see very strikingly that the great traditions did see that the pathway of human development and evolution all the way through, under the jurisdiction of this Logos, has been moving from egocentric ways of thinking and processing reality to this more integral, dialogic, holistic way where one enters into minding in the unified field, so to speak. So I think it's profoundly inscribed in all of our great traditions, both spiritual, religious, and philosophical.
And maybe because we're facing new crises on Earth, at least at a scale that's unprecedented, could this be an evolutionary driver towards the emergence of this capacity of direct encounter with the fundamental Logos?
I think that's well put, and I think that's exactly right. I think that when we speak of globalization now, and living in a global village. I mean, the word globalization has all sorts of connotations, some negative, some positive. Often people think of this economic, capital, imperialistic, corporate life spreading across the planet. But there's another sense in which worldviews coming together and having to learn to coexist and also facing profound violence and patterns of violence is a driver for this awakening moment. And I think your excellent point is that if there isn't something profound in evolution itself that's moving us into what you would call conscious evolution, then I think one would wonder, how are we going to move together as people into this more awakened space?
I think it's very encouraging to imagine that the process of creation is going this way.
Why? Because, again, if we go back to the Logos as the ground and the foundation and the generative source, the Logos has a profound logic to it. It has a logic of coherence. It has a logic that people speak of as the Dharma or love. And it is, in a way, it's very simple, is that all things are related and interrelated in a dynamic interplay.
Yes, and it's so interesting that the great physicists are now finding this unified field. I just heard John Hagelin speak. He ran for president on the Natural Law Party, but he's a major physicist.
Yes, he was just presenting last spring.
Yes, and he was saying that he feels very strongly that when any of us tap into the unified field, we also tap into the intelligence of that field that is creating everything.
Yes.
I can't think of anything more important than doing that. And he's calling for mass meditation, as you know.
Yes.
And he's raising funds to get 8,000 people at the Maharishi Institute, and they're trying to get 40,000 in India, because he believes if that many were tapping in together, it would make it available for more of us. Do you think there's some mechanisms like that at work here?
Exactly, and however you put it, whether you put it the way John Hagelin would or whatever, what I've found in my research across these traditions is a fundamental law from this Logos perspectives that suggests that we humans are as we mind. I found myself forced to use the word mind as minding, as an active verb, because whether we're ego-minding or whether we're minding in this dialogic, integral way, it completely and deeply transforms our reality. And I think one of the great findings of philosophy, East and West, is that we humans shape and help co-shape our reality by our patterns of mind. And
Yes.
begin to see that and enter this global perspective, one of the most striking truths we find is that mind is a powerful causal transformer of the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
And the World Commission on Global Consciousness, of which you are a member, I think its outlook is trying to bring out more that when you switch into this more integral way of thinking, mind is a powerful transforming causal force in the planet, so that you can understand why John Hagelin would want to say that, well, if a critical mass of people began to emanate this kind of positive intention and think in compassionate ways, that just the psychophysics of that will affect the fundamental field in a profound way.
Yes.
And so
yes.
there is that kind of mechanism, whether you speak in sciences of the butterfly effect, which is found sense in this unified field because everything is interactive and connected, so that the causal force of correct intention, as Buddha would say, right intention and right minding, is profound in shaping the human condition.
Yes, and one thing that you have done that I find so useful and exciting, because I did the same thing myself, is the way you use single brackets when the egocentric mind is speaking, which is your personality, local self, and you use the double brackets when the deeper self, which is an expression of the unified field, is speaking. And for many years in my journal, I would ask a question with the single egocentric mind, and then I would develop a poised mind,
Yes.
which was completely open, and in would come the deeper mind with, and I always use double brackets.
That's amazing.
And then I'd highlight the double brackets, and I could read through years of the logos.
Well, this is amazing because, in my I found when I was trying to help students step back from ego patterns, say when we're reading the Dhammapada, the Buddhist text, or the Bhagavad Gita, just pedagogically, to enter those texts, one has to become aware that ego thinking is a process that's under critical review. And I was forced to find a way as a logician to bring a notation to help as a pedagogical device to help students and people that I present through this in the public to quickly see that when we're speaking from the ego mind, I would just use single brackets, almost like quotation marks, to help us see that we're in the ego language and way of processing. And when we're speaking in the more meditative, integral, dialogic way, I use double brackets to mark that space. And that helped to accelerate the research process into this more integral way tremendously.
It's so brilliant, and in our community in Santa Barbara, we have developed a process which is probably very common, but we're doing it as a whole community of 100 people, which is resonance. And when the two or more gather in small groups and speak from within in a safe, empathetic space, what seems to happen is people are gradually shifting their identity from their egocentric mind to the deeper mind, because when the deeper mind speaks and is affirmed by someone else's deeper mind, it seems to set the vibration internally.
That makes perfect sense, and I think that parallels the process we've discovered in deep dialogue in our institute, when we have people together who are coming at very different narratives and perspectives and even profoundly different worldviews, to connect in real dialogue, deepest dialogue. They begin to enter that common space, which is a safe space that they can begin to share. So when deep dialogue works, there's an incredible amount of community building and solidarity that you could feel amongst the participants.
Ashok, when you have people that are really egocentric, let's face it, and they're strongly egoically committed to their points of view, what technique do you use to dislodge that?
Well, there are many different techniques that I think that the great traditions have developed, so it's not like starting over.
No, but I have to, we're going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back, but let's think of the ones that you use.
That's great.
Because you use them with world leaders, they're not in an ashram or a monastery.
No, we'll talk.
This is Barbara. I'll be right back with Ashok. And you are listening to Live from the Peace Room here on Wisdom Radio.
You're listening to Live from the Peace Room with Barbra Marx Hubbard. Send email to barbramarxhubbard@wisdommedia.com. Here again, Barbra Marx Hubbard.
Welcome back to Live from the Peace Room. This is Barbara, and I'm here with my guest, Dr. Ashok Gangadeen. And Ashok's forthcoming book, The Awakening of the Global Mind, further develops these themes that we've been hearing. Ashok has appeared on NBC News and CNN Headline News, in addition to being a guest on the national series Thinking Aloud. He is currently the host of the award-winning, Emmy-nominated live call-in TV show, Philly Live, your international connection on WYBE-TV public television. Welcome back, Ashok. Thank you for your wonderful work to bring all of this out into the general public. And we were talking about in your method of global dialogue.
Yes.
I realize that there are great traditions of tapping into the source, but how do you do it with world leaders and a lot of tense situations? We're not in ashrams or meditative states.
Yes, exactly. And you know, this is something that just in terms of teaching the great texts in my classroom here at Haverford, it's not an ashram, obviously, and we're dealing with the deepest transformations of human reason as we enter these texts. One of the things I would say is that if we think of the ego as far away from this other consciousness, then it seems to be very much of a challenge to how do you go into this deeper space. But really what we see is that we are constantly situated already in this deeper, let's call it double bracket space at all times. Mm-hmm. Ego self is already situated in the deeper self. And so the techniques that have been developed through the centuries by different traditions, I mean, Jesus, for example, would say, unless you die, you cannot be born again, which is a way of putting that unless you can let your identity, your fixed ego identity that you're fixated with, let it go so that you can go into this deeper space, that you have to somehow let that go. And that is certainly true of the Buddhist tradition as well. I try to help my students see, before we get to the world leaders, that we have access to this constantly. We have high moments naturally and spontaneously, even as we go through our ego-bound life. I give examples of, say, a runner who's been running and trying so hard to run and running from the ego. And then one day, after 2-3 years of practicing in the fall, beautiful day, running cross-country, she is lifted up into a profound running experience where she just feels the presence and she feels quite blissful in the running. This kind of entering into the zone, as athletes would say, would be a spontaneous moment of going into this deeper consciousness.
Yes.
Alas, we come back to our ego patterns, and we wonder how we can get back to these kind of peak moments. So it's always around us, and in our high moments we touch that.
Mm-hmm. You know what, it seems to me, and it may be because I'm constantly seeking people out who are of this quality of being, that the veil is thinning between the egocentric mind and the deeper mind or the unified field. That maybe because of all the work that people have done, all the human potential and transpersonal psychology and reading all the books, or is it a natural force that seems to be emerging here?
I think it's both. As I said earlier, that I think that from the Logos point of view, this infinite force that surrounds us all the time is working its way out in its own inexorable logic, which is towards the direction of awakening to this more deeper global way of being, a human being, to the dialogic way. So I think, fortunately, it's not just up to us humans to orchestrate it all on our own. There is a profound force of nature, so to speak, and understood in the double brackets playing out. But picking up on the points you made earlier about our collective use of consciousness and mind affects the human condition. Mm-hmm. The cumulative wealth of the tremendous spiritual resources of our great traditions, East, West, Indigenous, through the ages, do have a cumulative effect in bringing us to this moment of our evolution.
Yes, yes.
There's a great shift, so I think both are working.
You know, I have a word for myself, Ashok. I'm calling myself a new indigenous person. Mm-hmm. And I would like us to realize we can be indigenous to the present, which includes all the fundamental wisdom traditions and brings it up through the development of the mind and the rational intellect and now the advanced sciences and psychologies. and the advanced concerns with a planet that could self-destruct or self-evolve, think of being indigenous to that.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I think that word indigenous, I hear you spelling it with the double brackets now.
Yes, I am I am indeed. And so how do you apply this then? You have a whole wonderful thing on integral education and how this point of view can be applied in the world in so many forms.
Well, that's right. And, one of the things you were referring to, this paper, The Missing Global Blueprint for Integral Education.
Yes.
This blueprint that has taken years to articulate is trying to show that from this double bracket or logos perspective, or from the global mind, you can begin to see the profound connection across our different disciplines and fields that you can't really get from an egocentric way of being in your discipline or your perspective. And that our fields are profoundly connected and interconnected in this richer field of global reason. And what we're doing, for example, this is actually being put into practice in Indonesia, where my institute, the Global Dialogue Institute, has been working with the Ministry of Education in Indonesia, sponsored by UNICEF, to actually begin to introduce as a pilot project the transformation of the classroom from their old egocentric structures into a renovated dialogic space. Imagine what a deep dialogue classroom would be like, where one regards the child as a sacred being, a dialogue being, and try to speak to that kind of intelligence from the earliest years. And that really is now entering its second year. The first year of launching this in 5 selected school districts is evolving. So it's not just a blueprint in the sense of paper or theory, but actually a blueprint that is operable in the world.
Oh, so do you have to train the teachers first, and then they work with the children?
Exactly. So we had a one-year teacher training program. We were in Indonesia working with about 50 star teachers from 5 different school districts, trying to introduce what we call the deep dialogue way of thinking, which is a highly teachable approach to pedagogy. And, for example, when you asked a moment ago, how do we deal with leaders, whether it's interreligious leaders, we've had meetings, for example, with religious leaders in New York City in the Partnership of Faith, where they've been trying so hard to come together and find common ground, but they still keep hitting the walls of their own religious language. And when we took them in a one-day workshop into the 7 stages of deep dialogue, which is something I wrote about 6-7 years ago as a meditation, of taking us from this ego way of interpreting reality from my perspective, step by step into opening up into being able to go into other worlds and opening up our minds into being multi-perspectival, so that we develop a capacity for deep dialogue, so that when we encounter a different world, whether it's a Muslim world or if we're in the Christian world and encountering the Hindu world, we don't interpret them according to our frame of reference, but we have the skills and capacities to morph into their ways of thinking as well, so that we begin to dilate our minds and intelligence to handle multiple perspectives at the same time.
Yes,
teachable skill. In fact, it's as old as the hills. And if you even think back to Plato's dialogues and Socratic wisdom and teaching through dialogue, that theme of dialogue as a great ideal of expanding human reason and intelligence is a very classic way to proceed.
Yes, yes. And so now if you just take a moment to look at the world situation, Ashok, and one thing that it just wrenches my heart to realize, with all the work that has been done with the great wisdom traditions, the philosophies, the teachings, the trainings, and so forth, that somehow the current leadership of many powerful nations and religions seem to be so stuck in the egocentric that it's shocking.
That's true.
There's a shocking world situation at the leadership level.
Yes, that's exactly true. I think it's quite urgent, very urgent.
Is it that in order to become a leader today of the existing structures, that you have to be really good at egocentric thinking?
Maybe that's true, but I think that nature evolves only in the 11th hour in choice, but to awaken or perish.
I feel the same thing. I mean, I love the whole Prigogine theory that at the time when the system is out of equilibrium, the least bit of order in a sea of disorder can help shift the system to a higher order.
Yes. So that's one of the patterns. And so in a way, the reason I'm optimistic at this time when we seem to be surrounded by such grave dangers on all sides, and I think we are facing real danger, what I begin to see from this perspective is that the planet is in a deep and painful shift from egoic structures which dominated all of our institutions and our home life and our human relations, to finally begin to, in a corporate way, enter into these skills of deep dialogue, more mature reason, integral thinking. And I think we've reached a point where the older patterns of so-called single bracket culture is dysfunctional and bankrupt. And
yes.
No choice to survive and be sustainable than to move into this more integrative way.
I think you're exactly right that the dysfunctionality of it and the danger of it as the violence increases and the weapons of mass destruction increase and the environmental threats increase, that we are facing an ultimate evolutionary driver. And from let's say this is a faith statement from an evolutionary perspective, that the design sometimes forces the mutation through the extreme stress in which that we find ourselves. So those of us who have a tendency toward integral thinking, towards holistic experience, are being pressured now to come together in a new way.
Yes, that's what I find fascinating and encouraging, Barbara. That in the last decade, I found such an acceleration of colleagues around the planet in so many levels, from kids to mature adults, who are all feeling a groundswell of a shift taking place. And they hear it more and more and accelerating day by day. And so I think something is afoot. And it's very...
I think so. Now, I'm going to ask you a really difficult question that I'm pondering constantly, because a dear friend of mine said the other day, you know, Barbara, there's absolutely no strategy at the level of transformational, evolutionary, spiritual leadership. We're all doing these wonderful things, but we hardly, I'm so lucky because I have a radio show where I get to talk with you. And I know you've done many things to bring us together, but we'll be right back after this break, and I'd like you to be thinking about, is there, in the universal logic, a natural strategy here? This is Barbara, and you are listening to Live from the Peace Room on Wisdom Radio with Ashok Gangadeen.
Wisdom Radio now returns to Live from the Peace Room with Barbra Marx Hubbard.
Welcome back to Live from the Peace Room. This is Barbara, and I'm with my guest, Dr. Ashok Gangadeen, discussing the awakening of the global mind. Ashok, I left you with a really challenging question. Is what innate, natural, universal strategy for the coming together of that which is tapping into the unified field, if you want to put it that way? Why is it that we have so much difficulty coming together, and do you see a pattern or design that we could follow here?
Well, I think I see two sides to that great question. One is the fact that, take the latter point, that I think we cannot underestimate the depth of the way in which humanity has been entrenched in egocentric thought patterns, east, west, and across the planet. We might try to glamorize the Eastern cultures, Hindu thought, Buddhist thought, that may have, from a very early time, speak of integrative life. But you look at the actual scene in India and Pakistan and villages where there's violence, and people are still lodged profoundly in egocentric patterns. They're all around the world.
Yes.
I think we just have to acknowledge that that is a profound pattern, almost like a technology, a stage of our evolution that we've been stuck in, and it's profoundly destructive, and that has been known. Now, having said that, I think the flip side of the question, which is so good, is what we said earlier is that it's not only humans taking it on their own will to change alone, fortunately, that nature in this double bracket sense as the logosphere in which all cultures are situated, which is the infinite force field, it holds sway. The infinite force is profoundly influential in the human condition. Once we acknowledge that, call that nature, or double brackets, as a natural force, its inevitable logic and direction plays out towards awakening out of these egocentric patterns. So that is how I would say we are in the midst of a profound evolution of the human being.
Yes.
That after these centuries and millennia of teachings across our cultures of pathways into this, I think this acceleration we're in now, when you say, well, what are the natural strategies? I see two things. Once we recognize natural forces working, one is the deep force towards profound networking. You pointed a moment ago that people of like mind who are entering into this integral way and seeing its power are coming together and forming a solidarity and a culture, a logos culture. I think that's happening, and that's going to continue to accelerate. That's a natural unfolding. So deep networking and almost creating an energy field around the planet as like-minded people across borders begin to discover one another and find a common language.
Yes.
The second factor I would say is in that networking is, that's why I use the double brackets. I think we're going to find more and more. I see the double brackets as a simple technology to help accelerate our coming to that common ground and coming to that common logos grammar. We need deeper global values and ways of thinking as the global mind awakens. And that's an integral factor to this profound networking and developing of a global culture and a global human being. And when I say global, I mean the space in which we are integral, non-dualistic, holistic, integral, and so forth, and dialogic. Yes. So to me, the deep dialogue way is what integral and holistic comes to. And those are learnable skills as we learn to find ourselves in this I-thou way of being, as Buber would put it. When I begin to recognize a not separate entity, but that my being flows into this field and I can find myself in you and see you in me, that's the I-thou way, then it follows very immediately that to care for myself, I have to care for you. To care for
well, so beautiful, because it looks like the great fundamental golden rule commandment, love the other as self.
Exactly. In fact,
we're pressing toward that.
Exactly. And in fact, ironically, I think that's the heart of ethics. Ethics is where you come out of the ego, so that whatever ego ethics you may have, it's still a precursor to the flourishing and birthing of human ethics, which is coming into this dialogue way.
This is what Aurobindo says, that ethics is a stage when you're still in the egocentric thinking, because you have to have ways of not killing each other, hopefully. But once you move into the unified field consciousness, you don't have any intention of killing anybody or of robbing or stealing, or because you are connected.
Exactly.
And that's because you can't ever legislate world peace.
That's right, exactly. That's a very profound point, and I think that as egocentric cultures try to make peace in the ego space, they found it profoundly frustrating and self-defeating. And
yes.
Teachers have pointed that the peace is to be had by entering into this compassionate dialogue way of being. And as you rightly point out, that the source of violence traces to this egocentric pattern that produces violence. And when you spoke of weapons of mass destruction, we can always look out to objects and weapons out there. But I think that the great teachers have pointed out that the ego mind is itself a weapon of mass destruction.
It's just the weapon the mind has gained more power from its egocentric perspective to self-destruct. That's the thing.
Exactly.
It's going to hit itself, you see, because the enemy is now us.
Exactly right.
And we can't separate from that. So, Ashok, we have a couple of minutes left, and I just want you to go into that double brackets and to speak to us as much as you can from that deeper self, what guidance, inspiration that you would have for our listeners in their own lives as to how best to apply this.
Well, I missed some of what you said, but I think I've got it. And
I'd like you just from the double brackets inside yourself to speak to our listeners as to how they can apply this most immediately in their own lives.
Well, again, the double bracket simply indicates it's a shorthand for recognizing that when one is in this integrative way of being and beginning to see that one is not a separate entity but profoundly woven into the fabric of existence itself, and and therefore profoundly interrelated, begin to actually tap and experience that and practice that, which is what our great spiritual teachings have advised us and prescribed us to do, we begin to cultivate the sense of compassion with one another and deep listening and the skills of deep dialogue. And Barbara, I really find that at the heart of science itself. An astute, observant scientist is one who practices the art of deep dialogue, which means not imposing one's pre-theoretical structures on the object before us, but also open up and let it speak in its own way as the evidence speaks and revises us. So that dance of experimental revising spirit is very much in the scientific spirit, moved from the single bracket into this double bracket, a form of dialogic reason coming to maturation. So I would just say that everything in our culture now is a very exciting moment, whether it's civic democracy, that democracy is this place of deep dialogue, and the older egocentric spaces have just turned out to show themselves to be dysfunctional. And to renovate the civic space in ways that we can celebrate true differences in individuality and yet proceed in profound respect for one another. So in this bracket, so to speak, integral space, I see a very different scenario than what Huntington speaks of the clash of civilizations as a future for the planet. That's a single bracketed way of looking at the scenario. If one only has a single bracket egocentric perspective, then the clash of civilizations and of people and of religions and of individuals in violence seems to be the outcome. But when one recognizes that there is this more profound way that has been open for centuries and millennia, that's a birthright, that presents a very different alternative and happier future for humanity.
Yes, so that's why the realpolitik and the people who think they're so realistic could be actually very unrealistic.
I think that's exactly right. Exactly right.
They are, and I hope you will check our website, www.consciousevolution.net, Ashok, because we are providing an evolutionary transformative education globally now on the internet, and you are one of our advisors, and I want to make sure people will hear this tape, but that you also can, that your new book can be made available to us, and people can check into your website. I'd like to give your website, www.global-dialogue.com. That's global-dialogue.com. And I think, Ashok, that the way you've been bringing people together in the spirituality, what's the name of that activity that I'm part of?
You mean the World Commission on Global Consciousness?
Yes, that's part of what you're talking about, the radical deep networking.
That's right.
Of people like ourselves, and it's happening everywhere. And our purpose in our new website called Evolve is to have a space for partners of people who are working very deeply in many networks, for the partners to connect with each other. Yes. So we're very eager to talk with you, Ashok, so that your work could become a partner with others who are joining together to see if we can learn social synergy at the level of leadership.
Yes, well, I think that I feel a great affinity with what your community is working on and your own work in conscious evolution. I think that the direction of my research really bears out what you're speaking about.
Yes.
Reached a point where our evolution turns upon our conscious self-management.
Exactly. Well, this is my interview with Dr. Ashok Gangadeen, The Awakening of the Global Mind. Thank you so much, Ashok. It's really been illuminating. And this is Barbara, and you've been listening to Live from the Peace Room here on Wisdom Radio. Thank you, Ashok.
Thank you, Barbara, very much. My pleasure.
You've been listening to an original production of Wisdom Radio, a division of Wisdom Media Group Incorporated, copyright 2002, all rights reserved. Wisdom Radio, streamed on the World Wide Web at wisdomradio.com and beamed across the country on Sirius Satellite Radio. This is Wisdom Radio.